Medicine Hat, Alberta. A small city tucked into the prairies of southern Canada. The kind of place where the sky feels enormous and the streets feel safe. Where people wave at strangers and kids walk home from school without anyone worrying. It's early morning. There's no screaming. No broken windows. No obvious sign that anything is wrong. It's quieter than that. The kind of quiet you almost ignore, until something about it settles in your chest and refuses to leave. The house on 12th Street Southeast looks normal from the outside. Nothing disturbed. Nothing out of place. But inside, something has already happened. Something that hasn't been discovered yet. And one person has already walked away from it. This is the story of Marc, Debra, and Jacob Richardson. A family killed inside their own home. And what makes this case one of the most unsettling in Canadian criminal history isn't just the violence. It's who was involved. It's how it unfolded. And it's the question that lingered long after the trial was over. How does something like this happen? And how does no one stop it? Marc Richardson was 42 years old. By all accounts, he was steady. The kind of person who worked, came home, and kept things moving without drawing attention to himself. People described him as calm. Even-tempered. Not someone you'd associate with chaos. Debra Richardson was 48. She paid attention. She noticed things other people might miss. Especially when it came to her children. In the weeks leading up to her death, she had concerns, not vague ones, but specific, growing concerns about her daughter. And then there was Jacob. 8 years old. He lived in a world that was still simple. School. Home. Television. Small arguments with his sister. Whatever tension existed in that house, he wasn't part of it. Not in any way he could understand. The fourth member of the family was Jasmine. 12 years old. From the outside, nothing about the household suggested anything extreme. But inside, something had been shifting for months. Slowly. Quietly. In ways that didn't immediately register as dangerous. Until they were. Jasmine had started to change. Not all at once. Gradually. She became more withdrawn. More distant. Her interests shifted toward darker themes. Music. Clothing. Ideas that revolved around death and identity and not fitting in. On its own, none of that is unusual for a young teenager. But then she met someone. Jeremy Steinke was 23 years old. Online, he didn't present himself as an ordinary person. He described himself as a 300-year-old werewolf. He wrote about drinking blood. About being something outside normal human boundaries. It wasn't just style. It was the identity he leaned into. And to a 12-year-old who felt misunderstood at home, that kind of identity didn't feel strange. It felt compelling. They met in person at a punk show in Lethbridge. She wasn't supposed to be there. She had told her parents something else. Something easier. Something that wouldn't raise questions. The relationship developed quickly after that. Messages. Calls. Meetings. And over time, the connection between them intensified in a way that was hard to see from the outside, but impossible to control once it took hold. Debra Richardson noticed. She didn't have the full picture, but she knew enough to be concerned. She tried to intervene. She restricted internet access, monitored communication, tried to cut off contact between her daughter and a man more than a decade older than her. She pushed back. And that pushback mattered. Because by that point, the relationship had already gone further than she realized. Much further. In the weeks leading up to April 23, 2006, conversations between Jasmine and Jeremy had shifted. They weren't just talking about being together. They were talking about removing obstacles. Specifically, her family. These weren't vague statements made in anger. Investigators would later uncover messages that showed clear intent. Discussions about killing her parents. About what life would look like afterward. It had moved past fantasy. It had become a plan. April 22, 2006. The family spent the day at home. Nothing unusual. No moment that stood out at the time as significant. Marc was around the house. Debra was doing what she normally did. Jacob was being ate. Jasmine was quiet. By then, that quiet had become normal. Something the family had adjusted to without realizing how much it had changed. That night, after her parents went to bed, Jasmine let Jeremy Steinke into the house. And once he was inside, what followed happened quickly. Marc Richardson was attacked first. Then Debra. Then Jacob. The violence was deliberate. Close. Personal. This wasn't something that escalated in the moment. It had been decided beforehand. Afterward, they didn't leave immediately. They stayed in the house. The same house where her family lay dead. They watched movies. They slept. And in the morning, they left. Later that afternoon, an 8-year-old boy walked up to the Richardsons' front door, hoping his friend Jacob could come outside to play. He rang the doorbell. No answer. He waited. Then he moved closer to a window and looked inside. What he saw was a nightmare. There was a body. Motionless. He ran home and told his mother. And by around 1 p.m., the quiet street was no longer quiet. Police arrived. When officers entered the home, the reality became clear. Marc and Debra Richardson was dead. And in his room, in his bed, 8-year-old Jacob Richardson was dead. 3 members of the same family. Inside their own home. The investigation moved quickly. There were no signs of forced entry. That mattered. Because it meant whoever had done this had been allowed inside. Or had already been there. The only person missing from the house was Jasmine. That absence became the focus almost immediately. At first, she was treated as a missing child. But it didn't stay that way for long. She was found the next day. With Jeremy Steinke. Alive. Together. And that changed everything. What investigators uncovered in the days that followed reshaped the case completely. The messages between them. The planning. The intent. This wasn't random. And it wasn't sudden. Both were arrested. Jeremy Steinke was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Jasmine, at 12 years old, was also charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder under Canada's youth laws. The evidence was difficult to ignore. She had expressed the desire to have her parents killed. She had helped make it possible. She had let him into the house. Jeremy Steinke carried out the killings. But he hadn't acted alone in planning them. There was another detail investigators uncovered. One that sits quietly in the background of the case, but changes how you see it. Someone else knew. Before any of it happened. Her name was Crystal Hoff. She was a friend of Jeremy Steinke's. She later testified that he had told her about the plan, while they were using drugs. He talked about killing Jasmine's family. About what he intended to do. But she didn't believe him. It sounded extreme. Unreal. Like something that wouldn't actually happen. So she didn't report it. She didn't tell anyone. And that detail doesn't change what happened. But it adds something difficult to ignore. Because the plan wasn't completely hidden. It was spoken out loud. And it still moved forward. Jeremy Steinke went to trial in 2008. His defense argued that he had been influenced, manipulated by a 12-year-old girl. That argument didn't hold. The evidence was clear. He had planned it. He had entered the home. He had carried out the killings. He was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Jasmine's case was different. Because she was 12. Because she had been in a relationship with an adult. Because the law had to account for both of those facts at the same time. She was tried under the Youth Criminal Justice Act. Her identity was protected. Much of the process was shielded from public view. The central question wasn't whether she had been involved. That had already been established. The question was how to understand that involvement. Was she acting independently? Or under the influence of someone older, someone who had shaped the way she thought, the way she saw herself? The answer, in the end, wasn't simple. She was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder. She received the maximum sentence allowed for a youth in Canada, 10 years. A combination of custody and supervision. She was later released and has lived under a new identity. And that's where the case stops being straightforward. Because it forces 2 realities to exist at the same time. She was a child. And she was involved in planning the deaths of her family. Jeremy Steinke was an adult. And he carried out the killings. One influenced the other. But neither reality cancels the other out. For Medicine Hat, the impact didn't fade quickly. It wasn't just the violence. It was the idea that something like this could develop quietly. Inside a normal home. Without anyone fully seeing it for what it was. And then there's the part that lingers. The part that doesn't resolve. The messages were written. The plan was spoken. At least one person heard it. And still, nothing stopped it. Because sometimes, the most unsettling part of a case isn't what people did. It's how close it came to being prevented. And how easily it wasn't.